today's session. So my name is Cassy Dorff, and I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University in political science. I'm also affiliated with the Data Science Institute here, and I co-host this, which is the Online Peace Science Colloquium with Brad Smith, who is also at Vanderbilt. This workshop is a series of online meetings and workshops associated with the Peace Science Society, and our mission is to advance research before and after the Peace Science meetings and to facilitate engagement with a broader audience through the use of this online platform. Today we have Carly Wayne, who's at Washington University St. Louis, and she will give us a brief presentation of her paper entitled Terrorist Group Abilities, Ideology and Motives, tAIM, maybe is the way we pronounce the acronym, introducing a new global database on terrorist groups and activities. We have three fantastic discussants joining us today: Jakana Thomas from Michigan State University, hello, Pauline Moore from RAND Corporation, and Ami Pedahzur at the University of Texas at Austin. So Carly will take a few minutes to give a brief overview of her paper, and then we'll open the floor for questions and comments, and we'll wrap up at the top of the hour. Carly, go ahead.
Okay, sure. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you, Casey, so much for organizing this, and thank you all for agreeing to be discussants for this. This is a co-authored piece with my colleague Roya Talibova, who is at the University of Michigan. And she couldn't be here today, so I'm going to take comments on her behalf, and we're going to debrief afterwards. And so just to give you a little bit of background on the project before I get into some of the details, this data set grew out of a collaboration on a different, more theory-oriented paper that Roya and I were working on and still are working on the connection between what we call means and ends, that essentially do the relative scope of a terror organization's motives shape the kind of tactical choices they make when engaging in terrorist tactics. And this idea itself was brought on by the observation that there's actually a pretty profound variation in the kinds of terrorism that different organizations perpetrate over time. And we wanted to understand whether these differences were coming from different strategies that groups with different kinds of motives were pursuing. And so to do this paper, we developed this data set, and kind of along the way discovered that this could be a potentially really useful public good. And we ended up expanding the data set in scope beyond what we had originally planned on doing, and spun this off into this whole kind of separate project that we're pretty excited about. The motive, or kind of the challenge for doing this data set, is that most of the existing data on terrorism tends to be analyzed at the event level, most notably the Global Terrorism Database, but also many others. And this is useful for many research questions that we might be interested in, and there are real theoretical reasons why you might want to look at terrorism as an event rather than a group phenomena. But in other cases, when you're interested in kind of the overall strategy of an organization, terrorism is fundamentally about some kind of group level or organizational affiliation. And so without a global data set that looks at this phenomenon from the level of the group, we're just limited in the kinds of questions that we're able to ask. And if you're interested in understanding the internal strategic calculus of an organization, then having this kind of group level information could be really useful. And so to collect this data set, I won't go into the details which are in the paper, but essentially we start from the events-based global terrorism database. We drop out the unknown or anonymous attacks, which is a pretty large portion of the overall attacks. And then we go through this pretty extensive data cleaning process where we try to organize the group names, cross-validating these across multiple other data sets to merge similar group names into the same group. It's a pretty intensive process that I'm happy to chat more about if you guys have questions, but I won't go into the details here. And then we also remove or drop attacks that are perpetrated by things that are not organizations. So if it just says something like Ukrainians or something, then that gets dropped as well, because we're interested here, again, in how the organizational structure of a group is going to impact their targeting. And so these kinds of lone wolf attacks or ones by generic perpetrators are not relevant for our purposes. And then also, because we're interested in strategic processes over time, we keep organizations that have launched at least 2 attacks. And so there's a couple important caveats to note here. One, we're using the Global Terrorism Database as our basis for building this data set. And so what that means is we are only going to have information on groups that perpetrated at least 2 events that the GTD classifies as terrorism. And so groups that are not, so events that are not categorized as terrorism by the GTD are not going to be in here, which means that for any given group, we're probably only going to have a subset of their attacks. We're not going to have the full range of every kind of violence that they perpetrate. And in addition, because we are dropping lone wolves and things like that, we are only interested in hearing kind of organizational groups that have a very clear organizational structure. So I just want to give you kind of an overview of some of the descriptive stats that we've collected using this data set. So one of the really unique contributions, I think, of this data set is its hierarchical design. And so what I mean by that is we've maintained the event level variation from GTD. And so, for example, each event still has its GTD identifier. And so if you want to analyze the data at the event level, you still can with just the addition of variables that we've added. However, in addition to that, you can also analyze the data at the group year level and at the group level. And so basically within the tAIM metadata, there's essentially 3 separate data sets, one of which is event level information, one of which is group year level information, and one of which is group information. And so we think that this multi-level nature of the data set is one of the key contributions and will help researchers address a variety of different kinds of questions that they might have. In addition, just the scope of the data set is very large. We have 935 organizations in this data set across the world, and many of these organizations are very small organizations or organizations that only perpetrated maybe 2 or 3 attacks back in the 1970s or 80s. And so these are groups that are not necessarily in existing group databases, of which there are some. I go through in the paper in more detail some of the other group-based data sets that exist out there and how we build on them and try to improve on them. And I'm happy to chat about those more if you guys have questions about that, but I don't have slides particularly on that. So just to give you guys kind of a descriptive feel for what the data set looks like. Here is just some information about the number of attacks that we have that are occurring in conflict context versus non-conflict contexts. So this is drawn from data we've incorporated into the data set from the UCDP. And so for each event in the data set, it takes on a value of 0 or 1 for whether it occurred in a country in which there was an existing conflict as defined by the UCDP. And then we also break it down by type of conflict. And so we think that this is a really valuable feature to add conflict information into this event level information because, as you can see, a lot of terrorism happens in conflict contexts and in fact only seems to be increasing in recent years. And so this is just kind of one descriptive thing that you could do with this data is by merging terrorism data with location information. So we have stuff on polity or government type, stuff on instability and civil conflict. You can answer a bunch of descriptive questions as well. And then just to turn to some of the group level information that we're really excited about because it required a lot of original primary source research that was very time consuming, frankly. So this is temporal trends and group goals. And so the y-axis here is just the number of groups in our data set that are coded as having one of these 7 different goals that we identify. And we've adapted this coding scheme from Jones and Lembicki's earlier work in this area. And what I think is interesting is that, first of all, regime change and secession continue to be kind of the largest or most important group goals for terrorist organizations. But that there is substantial variation over time, and most notably the rise of empire goals in the late 1990s, and this is in part tied to the rise of jihadi groups that are seeking a global caliphate. What's even more interesting, I think, is the change in ideology over time, because here you actually do see really strong shifts in what the prominent ideology of terrorism is. In the 70s and 80s, left-wing terrorism is overrepresented, but currently today, the most important source of terrorism is actually nationalist movements, and closely followed by religious organizations, which again tracks with the rise of jihadi terrorist organizations. Another interesting thing that I think we do with the data is we separate out information, event-level information on where an attack occurred versus group-level information about where a terrorist group originated or what their base of operations is. And so here we're looking at the group-level information on where a group is based or where it was born. And what I think is the most striking about this figure is that when you look at the number of terror groups that are born in a country, the United States is actually very close to the top. And I think that this pulls against some narratives that we have about how the United States doesn't really have as much of a terror problem as they think. There are actually a lot of groups that are being born in the United States as compared to other countries. In some of the analysis that we do at the back end of the paper, we show that this is part of a larger trend in which democracies are actually birthing more terrorist organizations than autocracies, but that they are at the same time suffering less attacks than autocracies. And so again, this speaks to the importance of a more complex analysis that's going to distinguish between these group level factors of what kind of attributes of a country increase the likelihood that a terror group is born versus these event level attributes, which is what kind of features of a country determine whether it's going to be attacked by a terrorist organization. And we think that this has something to do with the interaction of regime type and stability, as we explore later in the paper. And so this is just a figure that demonstrates this interaction of instability and regime type. And I think one important thing to note here is that we're focusing on the frequency of attacks within group. And so it's not the overall frequency of attacks that a country suffers, but given a specific organization, how frequently on average are they launching attacks against democracies versus autocracy, against countries that are in civil war versus not civil war. And we find pretty strong differences depending on whether we look at the country of birth versus the country that is actually being attacked. Specifically, we find that a pretty counterintuitive result that, again, democratic countries are more likely to have more groups, but they're attacking with less frequency. When you add civil war into that mixture, however, civil war increases with polity score, which means that democracies that are fighting civil wars, all of a sudden the groups operating in those contexts are able to attack a lot more frequently. But when you look at the country of origin, which is the graph on the right, you see an opposite relationship where it's actually autocracies that are in civil war context that are suffering the most frequent attacks. And we think this probably has something to do with what civil war means in democratic or autocratic countries. In democratic countries where there's civil war, there tends to at least some vestige of the state remains and may be able to have some kind of enforcement capacity. In these autocratic countries, when all of a sudden there's a civil war, it's much more of a failed state-like environment. And so these groups are able to operate with near impunity. So it's kind of a complex thing to boil down, and we're still trying to figure out how to describe these complex relationships in a clearer way in the paper. But the point is that the variables collected by tAIM allow us to kind of dig into these very contingent relationships between kind of birth country, attacked country, the interaction of regime type and instability, and how this all is going to actually play into the group level strategic calculations of an organization. And so there are a few challenges that we had to work through when we were building this data set. The largest one, of course, was just finding data. We started out with a lot of missingness, did a lot of work with RAs to get this missingness to a pretty low number, actually. But of course, the missingness is probably not random in that the groups that we are most likely to have missingness on are smaller groups. I will note I think we've gone farther than almost any other group-based data set in terms of collecting information on these smaller organizations, but it's not something that can be completely eliminated as an issue. We also took a lot of care in thinking about the bias in the source material. Many of the data points on terror groups' motive and ideology often came from the organizations themselves in things that they were putting out online. We're joking with our RAs that we're all probably on some kind of terror watch list at this point, given all the time we've spent on terrorist websites. But we think that it's possible that this bias works in multiple directions. So when we have information that governments are providing, they might have an incentive to portray militants as more extreme and weaker, versus the organizations themselves would like to portray themselves as more moderate and stronger. So it's possible that this kind of evens out in the end, or at least that's what we're hoping. And then the final limitation is that some of these group variables, specifically motive, ideology, and strength, we treat them as static. And of course, in practice, it's possible that motives change over time, ideology changes over time. And so this is definitely a simplifying assumption. I will say that the kind of level of generality that we've coded these variables means that I think it's unlikely that many groups, or even like most groups, are changing their ideology at this level of generality, right? So this would be a left-wing group all of a sudden becoming a right-wing group, or a religious group deciding that communism was more important or something like that. And so it's possible that it does happen, particularly for the groups that last a long time, but I think it's probably not as common. Like, it's not a huge concern in terms of how common it is. So just to wrap up here, we see kind of three primary contributions here of the data set. First is just its size in terms of how the number of groups that it covers, which will allow researchers that are working in different regions, people interested in transnational, domestic, civil war terrorism, all these kinds of subgroups of terrorism to use the data set. The scope in terms of the breadth of coverage, so it follows the GTD, so it goes all the way back to 1970. It's a global data set. And the depth in terms of just the number of variables that we've been able to collect on each organization. And then finally, as I highlighted at the beginning, this idea that you can analyze this data at multiple levels of analysis. If you're interested in the kind of variation that goes on at the event level, you can use this data set. If you're more interested in the group structure, you can still use this data set. And then a final point that I forgot to put up here is its ability to be merged with other data sets. And so we have identifiers for several other event and group level data sets of conflict and terrorism. And so if there are variables that you're interested in that we don't have in here, there's a pretty large suite of other data sets that you can draw upon, at least for a subset of these organizations. So I will end there, and thank you very much for your time.
Great, thanks so much. And I think you can just go back, yep, and we'll be able to switch the screen back. Comments? Pauline, did you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. So I wasn't sure exactly how long you wanted us to speak. So please feel free to cut me off if I'm going over. What's appropriate?
You can just give a few of your main comments and keep an eye on the time. We have a little less than 45 minutes left, and then other people can jump in. And if there's time again, you can jump in later.
Okay, sounds good. So thanks, Carly. I thought this was an interesting read, and thanks for clarifying some stuff in your presentation just now. So overall, I think that this data set does certainly make an important contribution to the subfield of terrorism studies, primarily, like you said, by introducing this hierarchically organized data set on events and groups. As I see it, the main strengths are therefore its multi-level structure, as well as obviously the breadth and depth that it grants in terms of giving us new and consolidating information on groups, both temporally and geographically. So obviously the paper is intended as a data release article. So with this in mind, I'll focus on two main areas that I think could benefit from some improvement, with the goal of ultimately better selling your data to its potential users, both from the scholarly world as well as any policymakers or practitioners that might turn to this data for their own purposes. So I'll focus on first kind of how you frame the paper and the data itself, and then I'll focus a little bit on how you might turn to using more examples and kind of peppering examples throughout the paper to highlight its potential uses a bit more. So first on the framing, I'll focus on the introduction where you point to some of the discrepancies in the literature as they pertain to understanding the causes or proliferation of terrorism. So as you say, one of the main contributions of the data is this more in-depth attention that it grants to groups' organizational features, particularly ideology, group motives or goals, group abilities in terms of their size. Your introduction, though, and even the analysis that you use in the paper focuses very heavily, almost exclusively, on this debate about regime type and the effect that it has on terrorism, which is ultimately a debate about the effect of structural variables on this particular phenomenon. So if, as you're saying, it's the actual organizational characteristics of groups that are potentially more useful to improving our understanding of terrorism, features such as capacity, ideology, or goals, then I suggest that from the outset you focus more on these organizational debates in your framing of the actual data and of your paper. So for example, start by telling us what your data can tell us about, the role of ideology or motives or the interaction of these two variables in explaining certain dynamics. You also say very little in the paper about actual group abilities, which in and of itself can be conceptualized in a variety of different ways. So generally speaking, I think that the introduction, as well as kind of the body of the paper itself, could point more directly to a puzzle that the existing literature on terrorism doesn't or can't fully address through the use of existing data that suffers from this paucity of organizational data specifically. I will skip that. So the second point that I wanted to stress was, again, I think you've got a lot of room in this paper to use your data in innovative ways that its multi-level hierarchical structure allows you to do. And you also have a lot of room, I think, to take advantage of the wealth of examples and evidence that is in your individual data points. So I think that you would get a lot more bang for your buck, so to speak, in selling this data set if you include a lot more brief references to specific examples throughout the text to better convey the value and the innovative nature of this data. And presenting, clear, specific evidence will also give the reader and potential user a clearer picture of what the data looks like before actually delving into the data set itself when it becomes available, and also giving them a clearer picture of how they might employ it themselves to answer specific questions. So most importantly on this specific point, in kind of the analysis section of the paper, I would strongly encourage you to more explicitly use your multi-level data to address a specific research question, again, with the intent of selling this data and its potential contributions. So right now, the example that you develop in the paper investigates the effect of regime type on the frequency of group attacks. So you say that the data is well positioned to answer these complex questions by using event and group level data, but it's not entirely clear how your example is currently multi-level in nature. So one idea here that you might consider is the possibility of conducting some type of within case analysis, given the wealth of data that's included in the tAIM database. So think about maybe focusing on how on a specific group or a specific context, conflict context, to better illustrate the ways that researchers can use this data to build on existing studies. And again, here I mentioned this a little bit in my comments about the framing, but I think that the example that you're using is maybe too heavily focused on context and the effect of structural variables on groups' uses of terrorism. So the goal, again, is to highlight the value of these new organizational variables, essentially the variables that ultimately make up the name that you're assigning to this data set. I'd like to see you kind of showcase those variables more in some kind of mini analysis that answers a specific question that you're interested in. So again, like what can your data say about the role of ideology and motives, either separately or together, in terms of influencing groups' mobilization towards terrorism, about group longevity, about the lethality or effectiveness of attacks, etc. So to sum up on this particular point, what I'm kind of urging you to do, I guess, is to tell a story with your data that is better tied to these organizational variables that you're really stressing. And I think that you can do that through conducting, a maybe clear multi-level analysis that takes advantage of both the event level and group level data that you're including here. So I'll stop here. I've got a bunch of other comments. I'm also happy to send them via email afterwards. That's it for now. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Pauline. These are really useful feedback and reflect some of the stuff that we've been wrestling with the paper as well. So I'll just respond in brief. So first of all, the reason that we think of the analysis multi-level is this distinction between birth country, which is a static group feature, versus attacked country, which is a dynamic event level feature. And so that's what we mean there, but we could be clearer. And the reason we chose to focus on those kind of features rather than the motive, ideology, and capacity here, and this is something that we've been struggling with. Basically, we didn't want to step on the toes of the other paper that we are working on that basically explicitly is examining the connection between group motives and the kinds of attacks that they launch. And so we were trying to kind of stay away from that, but I think that that's problematic in the way that we're introducing the data paper, and one of the key features or the key contributions is that we have all this really great organizational level data, but we're not going to use it here because read our other paper. And I realize that that's a kind of problematic thing to do, and so we're trying to walk this tightrope in that way, and maybe we could find a way to do it better. And yes, I would love to have more examples and cases. And in fact, in this draft, we cut a lot of them for word length purposes because most data features require the papers to be very, very short. And I think that we maybe didn't get the balance right, that we could probably take out some stuff that's more of the nitty-gritty of the contributions and how we collected the data and reinsert some examples. And so we should play around with that balance a little bit more.
Carly, I'm just going to ask you really quick to turn off your screen sharing. It's fine. It doesn't, it's like hard to actually tell because this is what it would look like anyways, and then we'll get some comments from Jakana.
Let's try to even see where that is. Jakana, you can keep talking while I try to figure out how to turn off this.
I think it's the double box thing. If you see a double box icon, it's that.
So I largely echo a lot of the comments that Pauline gave. I think she's
spot on. Did I do it?
Okay. First, I really like the project. I think it's interesting, and someone who does work on terrorism, who does work on like group aims, all that stuff, I feel like this is a useful thing because for the people who have been working on similar kinds of projects, we have been restricted to, a smaller temporal domain or more limited geographic scope, and your efforts will actually help us broaden out our analyses a little bit more. And I'll come back to that because that's one of the suggestions I'm going to give you later. But I think in the vein of what Pauline suggested, you're kind of doing yourself a disservice by focusing so much on these state level attributes in this paper that is pushing this group level information. And it strikes me in reading it that I wasn't really sure what your paper was trying to do. I assumed it was a data release paper, but at the same time, it seemed like it was trying to be a substantive paper. And I would suggest that you lean into one or two. And what I probably would do is just break the paper into two. The first thing would be just a clear data introduction paper that would focus on the data that you have and highlighting the contributions of the data that you have. And so that would be focusing more on the group level attributes. And I wouldn't do what you suggested by taking out more stuff about how you coded the data, because that's what was actually interesting to me. I wanted to know more about the data itself and how it was coded. So you have all of this information in the code book about, you know, the types of sources you use, but it's missing entirely from the paper. And I didn't know how much I could trust the data without knowing more stuff about, you know, what was left out and what was included. And I think if you're going to sell it as a data paper, that's what you actually have to have in there. The other question that I wanted to know is, you mentioned so many times about how you have so much more data than everyone else. One question I had is, how did you get so much more data than everyone else did? Especially being a person who collected a lot of similar types of data. Missing this is a real serious concern. Even if you're super careful, even if you have a lot of resources, the data just are not really always there. And so the question one might ask you is, how did you overcome a lot of the issues that maybe BAD had, right? Then if I were going to focus this on as just being a data paper and not step on the toes of this other paper that you really want to work on, maybe one of the things that you could think about doing is comparing the data set you have to other efforts and showing how maybe by them not having as long of a temporal domain or having these very limited spatial scopes, that they're missing out on a lot of stuff that you have. And so that would be taking the BAD data, taking Fortna's data, taking my data on Africa and terrorism and civil war. And I don't want you to like pick my study apart, but if you had that, I would suggest you do that, right? And show us how we're missing stuff by not having this really, really broad data, right? Like showing us, and I mean, Fortna's definition of terrorism was a little bit different. Mine just focuses on Africa. BAD is just on like these highly lethal organizations. What do we get when we don't restrict in that way? And that's one thing that you can really show us that I think would be very, very cool. And I wouldn't be mad at you either. But shifting gears to the other side, I think if you're going to focus on, I think you're doing yourself a disservice by combining all this stuff into one paper, because you're not really doing as much as you can on the other side either, which is really explaining or delving into this relationship between regime type and terrorism, which I also find interesting. So here's maybe a third paper that you can work on. But if you did work on that, I think that there are some like obvious issues to me that you'd want to address. So figure 2, you read this as it being the case that more democratic states have more terrorist organizations, but I wonder if it's also the case that there's just more information available on democratic states, right? Which would explain why there are more cases of terrorism in India and the United States than maybe like Afghanistan, for example. And Pakistan is that makes sense that Pakistan would have as many cases as it does, but some of the other ones were a little bit striking to me. And so I'm wondering if you picked up the fact that there's missing data issues with small groups, but you didn't really think about the ways that the states themselves might produce these biases in the data. And so if you're going to go this route, there were a couple of suggestions I had about how you might be able to show me that I'm wrong, right? That it's not that democracies just produce more information and therefore you're better able to code, but it's actually that democracies produce more terrorism. And so one of the things that you could do is you could somehow integrate the information on the number of sources you were able to garner for each of these groups in each of these contexts, and show us that it's not that there's systematically more data on terrorism in these democratic countries. Another thing you could do is you could, well, I guess this is kind of shifting gears a little bit more, but another concern that I had on this kind of topic was that you show us in two different analyses of two different analyses, one focusing on the birth country of the group, the other one on the target country. It seems to me that for the target country, you don't actually need group data at all to do this. You could do this and replicate this without the group data. And what I think would be useful is to show us the same analysis without having all the information on the groups, because I'm worried about the list-wise deletion of you not being able to collect enough data on all these different groups and it being biased in all these different ways. But if you can show me that the results are exactly the same when I look at the groups that you coded, and then when we don't aggregate it to the group level, you're kind of showing me that it's not really the biases in your data that are producing the results. It's just what the data are showing us. So, I mean, I think that there are a couple ways that you can show me that it's not, that these biases are not as big of a deal as I think they are. I mean, I have a ton of other questions about just like small coding questions that I'd be happy to jump in at a later point, or I'll just send you these comments later. But I actually do think that this is a really cool effort. It's really good. I'm glad you're doing it. I will definitely be using your data at some point. But I do think you may want to think about which direction you really want to go with here, because you're in this paper, because you're pulling yourself in too many directions, and I don't think you're able to give it as much attention as you really probably could.
Yeah, thanks, Jakana. These are great. So a lot of the concerns about the focus on state level attributes as problematic that Pauline said, and I think that this is probably right. Again, it's stemmed from this desire to say, okay, well, we do have this group level information on where states are, or where terrorist organizations are born, and we can cross-check that with where they're launching attacks, and that's kind of some interesting variation there that we can exploit. But again, that's not maybe the central organizational level feature that we're interested in this data set. The other part of it that is group level data is their frequency of attacks. The frequency of attacks is actually within group, and so it's like a strategic frequency rather than just frequency within a country, and so that is group level. But I agree, it might not be the best example. This was basically, we wanted to do something along the lines of what you suggested, which is introduce the data and then show, oh, and if you use our data, you find something different than if you used other data. And so this was our example of, oh, and you find something different was if you pull apart democracy and civil war based on kind of where a group was born versus where they're actually launching their attacks. But maybe that's not what we should do, that it's just too complicated to squeeze into a data paper, and maybe we should do something more simple, just about region or group size or something like that. I think that's a good piece of advice, especially given the potential data bias issues when you think about democracies versus autocracies. And just your question about missingness. So I think we've solved some of the missingness problems, but not all of them, right? We don't have all groups that ever existed, but we have a lot. Part of it was just a very long time. We had a good team of RAs, and we worked on this for maybe, it ended up being like almost 3 years. It was supposed to be 1 year, so always. But also I think for some, I would say not most, but for at least a good chunk of these organizations, we're relying on maybe even a single source or two sources that had this information. And so part of that is just, you kind of have to, for some of these organizations, like there'll be a single news article from 1973 where the group said in a phone call that they were launching this attack because they were against Greece's policy of, like doing this thing, right? And so then we code them as policy change. And we don't have very much other information to corroborate that. And so that's just kind of part of the problems with the data. So we have coding sheets on every organization in the data set where we kept records of the exact quotes and sources and things like that were used to code this information. But inevitably, the smaller, older organizations just have less information than the newer, larger ones. And that's just kind of a feature of the data. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Other comments? Ami, did you want to comment?
I unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you now.
Well, so I don't have much to add to the previous comments about the analytical approach, and I think that you're doing what many papers are actually calling for, which is for the next step is to add more data, or to look at not to rely necessarily only on available data like GTD or CPOST that I don't think is available anymore, but rather to take it to the next level. And what I'd like to do is just to focus on the pre-analytical phase because you do emphasize, and I tried to read both the appendix and the paper. You emphasize your commitment to replication and transparency, and I think that this is very important here, especially considering this time that we're entering. And we have to remember that the data crisis or the replication crisis is occurring at the time of explosion of information. So I think that in many cases you can actually attain much more data more easily, but of course it's going to require labor of structuring unstructured data, which could be quite frustrating and take time. And this is something that I wanted to emphasize, because most of the work that rely on GTD are based on a point in time, 1970, which is arbitrary. It's not a point in time that has any kind of meaning, and therefore it's hard to draw conclusions from that choice of time. And debates about those issues go back to the 1970s. And another issue is that there is and I know that you try to control for many biases, and you try to look back into primary or semi-primary sources, but we have to remember that event data is probably the most sketchy kind of data that we have in political science, and it has inherent problems. First, the sources. I can tell you that looking back into databases that exist on terrorism, I found about 20% cases of either wrong data or even events that never happened, including in GTD, including suicide bombers who perpetrated an attack and the next day perpetrated another attack. And this because of the type of sources that we are using. And it's also the question of regional context. In many cases, and here I had some problems, probably my computer, the appendix crashed all the time. It would have been very effective if you could either create a relational database, maybe through GitHub or some other way online, because I tried to look into your list of organizations, and for me, the first, of course, I'm going to my, small area because it's easier for me to verify data based on that. And I can give you some examples of organizations that I'd never heard of. And I was trying to look up data, but since you had only the code and the name of the organization, it was hard to identify. For instance, Jewish armed resistance is something that I couldn't, it could be anywhere, but clearly, not an organization I've ever heard of. JDL, Kach, and Kahana, they overlap to some extent, and you have to break it by time. You did have a category of an Israeli settler, which was number 406, and then another category of Save Our Israel Land, which is 786, which again, I never heard of this group, but it could be, a translation issue. In the Palestinian case, it's even more complicated because, one of the issues is that referring to an organization is a little bit limiting, because if you refer to the PLO, you have to assume that Fatah is part of the PLO, and then of course all the other arms, and the Black Panther is actually part of Fatah, and so is the Eagles of the Revolution, and so there are within the organization, if we want to focus only on organizations, you have subgroups that operate or offshoots at a certain time. There were some quite exotic groups like the Palestinian Hezbollah, which I've never heard of, that and you have to remember that sometimes groups claim credit using just fabricated names. Sometimes it's intelligence agencies that use all kinds of, they try to claim responsibility and to provoke groups to react. So it would have been much easier to offer correction if the table in the appendix was a little bit richer in terms of data, times, when was the group established, where, etc. I think that you can, and again, this is not anything, you're taking it much further than most people in the field have done, and this is something that should be, you should be credited for. And I think that given that you guys clearly know how to write code in R, Python, and you made it, you animated it on paper, you can you should move from paper to online in order to allow people who are experts, for instance, in Africa, where we don't have, not all of us have the knowledge, could actually enrich your database. So you're talking here about the paper, but also about the public good. And the public good is going to involve the public. And if you can fork out some, subset of data and enrich it, and you can take it back in, you can have a much stronger database. So here you can actually create a collaboration among people. And I think that there is, what I see in the coding community is that people are actually quite collaborative. They try to help each other and try to fix mistakes that are that not everyone has. We have limitations of languages, and I would definitely get rid of cases of, if you had one newspaper article that refers to a group, I wouldn't use it. You shouldn't use such limited sources, and I would, urge you to try and use, if you prefer newspapers, don't use English language based unless the country, the dominant language is English, and you had, RAs from speaking various languages, because sometimes the bias is a result of the newspaper or the journalists who just don't want to, go to the battle zone and collect actual data. Sometimes they are limited by, they don't have access to it. So it would be very good to have someone that, for each case could provide you more than translation, but actually go to the real sources, to the language, to the original language, and also provide context for what was actually happening there.
Thanks, Ami. These are really great concerns, and especially kind of gets into the nitty-gritty issues that we faced while we were coding, and we've grappled with all of these at one point or another. So these are definitely really central to what we're doing. I'll just talk about a few of them. So I agree that English language is a problem in some cases. I speak Hebrew, and so I was able to do some of that. So my focus is also in the same Israeli-Palestinian, so I'll talk about those specific issues in a second. Roya speaks, 15 languages or something, so she was able to help with that. But I agree that we definitely, there are regions where we're relying on English exclusively, and we just that's a problem. One thing that we could do is we could go back to the coding sheet that we have for each organization. And we might be able to create some kind of a variable if the information is based off of a single source or something like that. And so that if researchers are interested in dropping groups that are based off a single source, then they could. What I suspect is that I'll eliminate some of the smaller groups, but leave some of the larger groups there. Another issue that you pointed out were just the boundaries between groups, and this is something that we struggled with a lot because in practice, often these groups are semi-affiliated, partially affiliated, different cells that take different names. And so in most cases, we just followed the conventions that were in the TORG crosswalk data, which is itself kind of an amalgamation of 6 different data sets, and they basically cross-validate the names and say these 6 organizations are the same, but these 5 are different, or something like that. And so we basically followed the conventions that they had done where it was applicable, where we had coverage. And in particular, when you mentioned some of these Palestinian groups that are different names, but they're actually all different parts of Fatah or all different parts of the PLO. And the reason that we chose to keep them separate is because they do have these kinds of separate cell structure where they're operating somewhat semi-autonomously from the larger organization. And so we thought that variation was important. But it's possible that we could maybe do another step where we create like an umbrella organization variable or something, so that if researchers want to collapse across these semi-autonomous groups, they could do that. I'd have to chat with Roya about how feasible that is, but that might be one way to address that kind of an issue. And I was also just speaking kind of personally about some of these Israeli and Palestinian groups. I also thought I knew most of the names of terror organizations in operating in that area until I started doing some of this. And I thought some of these groups were made up. And then lo and behold, I search it, and they are groups where I have multiple sources, like the Jewish Resistance Army one that you mentioned. It was a group in the 70s that launched attacks on the UN offices in the United States in support of Israel, for example. And this was like an organization I had never heard of, but nonetheless existed. And I think, again, that highlights maybe one of the benefits of the data set is that even some of the groups that have kind of been lost to history because they launched 3 attacks in 1 month in 1973 are still in the data set, or many of them are still in the data set. But I agree that as any kind of problems with GTD are going to be inherited in our data set, or many problems from GTD are going to be inherited in our data set. So if GTD has just made up a group name and then TORG has not somehow cross-validated that with other groups and just keeps it as is, then we're going to have that same problem. And that's just, we didn't see a clear way around that without essentially being subject matter experts on that exact region, which again speaks to your idea of having this be kind of like a living, growing database with input from people that are experts on, Ghana or on Nigeria or on Ecuador or something that could speak to it more thoroughly. And I think that actually we want to build a website. This was part of our plan. We want to have like an interactive website that people can use to get more information. We put it on hold partially just to get the paper out. And second, we kind of wanted to get the paper published before we just start putting all of the details of everything online. Not that we don't trust the entire academic community, but just we want to make sure that we get it out first. But these are helpful, so thank you.
Want to collect some more comments or questions in the last few minutes we have here?
I have a couple. So I was wondering if you're going to get this discussion about the democracy regime type and terrorism frequency. I was really puzzled because I was trying to understand what does it mean to think about a birth country as opposed to a country of origin. And then why would we actually expect that the birth country might matter as much as the location would, right? Because I understand it's 2 different things that you could derive data on, but I didn't really understand all the different ways that this could be a useful distinction. And even trying to understand it in the context of the question you're asking, what does it mean that the birth country is a non-democracy or a democracy? And what should we, take from that information? And so that was one of the questions I had. Another small one was about your figure that showed the different types of ideology. Mm-hmm. And you show that right-wing terrorism is declining. And that's actually really strange to me, given a lot of both policy and academics have found that right-wing terrorism is increasing. And there's just one site by Carla Cunningham that is really about this question. And it suggests that right-wing terrorism is exploding, but you actually do see a decline over time. And even if it's still not as frequent as the other types. I think the trend line is just a little bit interesting to me. So I would think a little bit more about that. And then the third thing, two other small comments. If you're gonna try to, you do work on terrorism. I think you might have a hard sell trying to send this paper with an OLS without saying that you also tried it with, various count models, given that that's just the convention in that literature. And then the last thing I will comment on is, I see a lot of similarities with the Forge data set that Jess Mades-Braithwaite and Kathleen Cunningham have worked on. And I would kind of look at that. Their effort is really about rebel groups, but I would look at it as a model because they have been able to, what they're intentionally trying to model are the relationships between organizations. And some of that actually might be useful for the ways that you're looking at groups that have merged together or that share some umbrella but still operate separately. But those are just a couple of the comments that I have.
Yeah, these are great. I've looked at the Forge data set and it's really cool. I think I can look at that idea for the umbrella idea. Right wing declining, I think that might just be a function of where our data ends, which is in 2015. A lot of the increases in right wing terrorism have been in the past 5 years or so. And so it's possible that we're just not picking that up. Most of the right wing
giving it was from 2003 that they suggested that around that time it had taken off from the 70s over that period of time. So it's not just.
Oh, so I should look at that. The right wing data, a lot of the right wing terror groups that are in our data set, they're in direct competition with a left-wing terrorist group. So this is a lot of Latin America, for example. They have these kind of competing right and left-wing terror groups that are both operating at the same time for control of the country. And so that's where we're picking up a lot of that data set, or it's kind of state military squads that are not really affiliated with the state that are trying to prop up a dictator or something like that. That's where a lot of the right-wing groups are coming from. But I'll look into that. It's possible that we're missing that, or that some of the rise in right-wing terrorism has not been organizational, but it's been this kind of atomistic white nationalists, and so that would also not pick up in our data set. And I'll just note the other comments just so I can pick up some other. Thanks.
Pauline, were you jumping in?
Yeah, I'll just add 2 points. So I think that Jakana's suggestion to turn this into 2 papers and to really focus on, for this particular one, on the data, including more information about your individual variables and how you coded them is probably the best strategy. On comparable data sets, one thought that I had while reading this is, in addition to maybe drawing in the Forge data and comparing your data to that, I think that David Cunningham's and other folks' NSA data, the non-state actor data, is similar to yours in that it focuses on these organizational variables, but for rebel groups. So maybe you could frame, maybe your part of your database anyway, at least the stuff that's focused on groups could be, its version of that for terrorist groups specifically. I think that would be a valuable way of really highlighting the contribution. And then, so the other thing that kept running through my mind as I was reading this is what are you adding other than the multi-level structure that is not in the recently released EDTG data set that Todd Sandler and others just released. So I think you mention it and you kind of differentiate your data a little bit, but I think you need to go into more detail on whatever discrepancies might exist. Like your data includes 175 more groups than EDTG. Why is that specifically? Is it because you're including criminal groups and political parties and they don't? But I think I think you need to make yourself stand out a little bit, given that recent release. So I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, I guess we're kind of close to 12, so I'll give a wrap-up comment in addition to responding to your comment.
Really quickly. I'm going to have my one comment of this whole hour to do finger for you to take home. I do think that since you are interested in this bridge to the Civil War community and literature, that selling a little bit more how much overlap this probably has with UCDP data and other data that is really derived from the actions of armed groups, whether it's against the state or whether it's against civilians, would be great, because the NSA data that was just mentioned is super limited. I think it ends in 2012 or 2013. A lot of us have ad hoc collected data on capabilities, which Jakana mentioned earlier, or other attributes of armed actors to study Civil War just for a certain case or just for a small collection of cases. So to me, there's like a really clear utility there that is also sort of being undersold in the paper. But now you can wrap up.
Yeah, thanks. So it actually relates to what I was going to say to Pauline as well, is that there are lots of other databases. We try to make the case that ours is broader, more comprehensive, and kind of better for many reasons, although not all reasons. And then, in addition, one of the things that we want to say is that you shouldn't only use our data. That for your purposes, you might also want to use UCDP, or you might also want to use Forge, or might also want to use these other kinds of things. And so, for that reason, we have all these identifiers to other data sets, so that if you are interested in those other data sets, you can still merge them with ours to collect, to add the variables that we've had, but use the one that's better suited for your purposes. And so if you're interested in rebel groups more broadly, then you can at least add the variables that we have for the ones that overlap, to the extent that that's helpful for you, but you don't, but you can rely on other data sets. And that's something that we see as a contribution, is that you can merge it with these other data sets. Some of them, so for example, the fact that we have like cow identifiers and stuff actually makes it mergeable with a lot of other data sets, because a lot of data sets use cow, for example, or things like that. And so the data sets that we list are not necessarily the exhaustive ones that can be merged with, because some of them can just be merged based on other things other identifiers that we have in the data. Or like a lot of them have the UCDP. So the fact that we have a UCDP means that anything that uses UCDP you can merge with. So stuff like that. And I don't remember, but I think Forge might have something with UCDP. I have to double check. So that's possible. So just to wrap up, thank you guys very much. As all of you know, because you've all worked with data collection a ton, it's a pretty messy process, and we're trying to streamline it as much as possible for the paper. And one of the challenges that I think we've run into is this balance of how much do we want to just list every single variable that we've collected and exactly how we coded it in a paper, versus highlight some of the more interesting or important ones in the front and then have a more extensive code book. And I think some of the takeaway from you guys is that you want more information on the data front and center, and then maybe a less complex case that we're going to analyze the data with. You can tell me if I interpreted that right.
Yeah, I will also just help close in that thank you everyone for participating. It makes these workshops really useful and fun and helpful for our presenters. And if you have any comments, please just send them directly to Carly. Yep. And that this will all be up online. If you have students or friends who are working on a similar topic, you can just send them the link. It'll be up on YouTube, and there'll be an email that goes out to direct you towards that. So thanks again, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you guys very much.
So again, title of my talk, Online Peace Science Colloquium, or How I Learned to Stop Praying and